introduce myself a little bit, give you a perspective on my background and how I approach things, and then I want to jump right into the topic, and hopefully it'll be interesting for you over the next hour or so. So the topic is data value governance, which I'm going to differentiate from simply data governance. And to me, there's a huge opportunity to reimagine the opportunity that maybe we've been considering as we're considering what governance means to us and how we have to maybe reimagine it to really produce substantial value for our organizations. So I've had a fairly lengthy career. I've enjoyed it. I'm an analytics consultant today, but I also spend a lot of time doing education through different venues. Part of it through Paul's organization with Starweaver, but I also teach for other organizations as well, also at some local universities in the Toronto area where I live. My whole career has been focused on data in various forms. That's been a common thread. I left engineering school. I went to graduate school for an engineering degrees several years ago. I have a master's degree in mechanical engineering. But my career has been, I've touched on things from operations, working in a control center for a big pipeline company. I've worked in the process control field. I've done lots of consulting at the business and technical level. I've been involved with software most of the times. I've provided leadership roles. I do a lot of work in education delivery, and I'm a conference speaker for different organizations. The common theme is data, 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 and I've lived that through different aspects. And as I said, I live in the Toronto area in Canada. So I want to give you some context of why I think this topic is important, and why I think we have to reimagine it, or at least consider how we're approaching what the problem I think really is emerging to become. So if we take a step back for a second and say, the world is, as we all know, is rapidly changing around us in terms of the economy we're in, the technology, the skills we have or we need, the data that's available, even our fundamental business models are changing. There's disruptors all over the place. So the pace of change is accelerating. So this provides, and because there's a whole bunch of new opportunities forming around the world of data, analytics, and insights that can drive new opportunities in our business models. And we see this evidence from people now studying and applying principles of data science, advances in analytics, and where we're eventually heading is probably some forms of autonomy and artificial intelligence. This is happening at a very rapid pace today. But this causes new risks and new challenges. How do we organize ourselves to take advantage of these opportunities? Now, if we think about it, success in any of these areas is based on blending a lot of different things together, many ingredients. We could think of this as almost like a chef, where we're combining different kinds of ingredients and components to produce something really quite compelling for our organization. So the challenge is, how do we combine all the necessary ingredients to be successful in the rapidly changing field of technology, data, and analytics? That's the premise here. So I want to take, before we get into the real theme of the course or of the webinar, I want to talk just briefly what I mean by the word governance. And this is kind of a generic view to see how we have to think about it in general terms, and then how we have to kind of morph it, I think, into a more modern perspective. So what exactly do I mean by governance? And there's probably different definitions out there, but think of governance predominantly as a process. It's a regulating process. It's a process that enables things. Now, what are the things I want to regulate and enable? Well, usually conditions of different things in general in our physical, financial, maybe our natural environment, or in our social systems. So we think of governance as a form of government. We set things in place to make our society a good place to live in terms of our physical, financial, and social interactions. It regulates how people behave. It should regulate how our processes perform. Now, how does it work? Governance is really a process, I said, but it works from the basis of policies. Now, policies are an expression of an intent. An intent has objectives with it. Policies have to get translated into procedures and things we actually do in a working day-to-day workflow kind of environment. But it also critically uses accountability assignment and enforcement as other tools of how to make the policies have impact. So policies are our tool, translated to procedures, but without accountabilities, nobody follows the policies. And so we have to have enforcement to make sure that we follow the things in a common way. And there's many examples in society. Think about safety. Think about financial regulation and compliance. Think about the traffic flow, our traffic system with signs and traffic lights and red lights, green lights, and stop signs and yield signs. This regulates and governs our traffic flow. How we adopt technology, dealing with fraud mitigations in all forms, dealing with environmental sustainability, equipment reliability, and asset-intensive organizations. So these are simply examples of things we want to accomplish by governing how we behave and how our physical and financial systems behave along with us. So that's governance in a general sense. Now, if we think about a model, the model might look something like this. It's simplistic on purpose here to talk about, we see 3 building blocks. So we think of governance as a process, but it influences and directly influences how people do work or how people behave. Now, how people behave and how they do work affects the things they actually interact with. So we think about governance as a process. It produces policies and assigns accountabilities. Workers do the work, and then based on the scope of the thing the workers are involved in, those are the things that become governed, whether they're pieces of equipment, whether they're financial accounts, whether they're customers. But when we govern the things in a way we want to, we try to mitigate the risks of those things, and we produce value along the way. Now, the whole input on the left side of the screen is we need a strategic intent of why we're doing this, and we have to understand there are many external drivers beyond our control that are changing how we have to react to externalities like competition or regulations. So this becomes a very general kind of view of governance. And just a second here. So if we think about, if we walk through this, so governance is policy driven, as I said, that's the main tool. It indirectly derives value. So governance by itself does not create value. It indirectly does by having, it influences the work that people do, and it's the work that people do that create the value. So accountability has to be assigned, policies are in place, and this is where the direct link is between the governance component and the value I want to produce. It helps us prioritize, or governance helps us prioritize and coordinate our work. So the result of governed work is alignment and impactful work. Now, what that means is the things we work on, the things, whether they're customers or products or whatever, are now consistent with our policies, which means we're trying to, again, reduce the risk and create value. So the things being governed could be anything from an asset to a customer, to a decision, to a process, to a capability. These become the things that we want to govern with policies. Now, this is a very general level here. I appreciate that. So if we think about the scope of governance, we have to have some way of defining what is the breadth and depth of the area I want to focus on. So I put 2 axes together here, which is sort of the goals of governance, like why are you doing it, goes back to your strategic intent, and the things being governed. And again, this is a laundry list of many, many things. This is just a general view. It could be the environment, it could be processes, people, or actions. And the reason we're governing it is on the y-axis as to become more capable, to ensure security is followed, to increase quality, etc. So this is a way to kind of think about the scope we want to define within some kind of a governance framework. So if we take these ideas, and we've historically been applying this to data over the last several years. So data governance as a discipline has been around since at least the mid part of last decade. It really started to get momentum really as a result of the financial crisis in the last decade. And so a lot of data governance principles were applied to try to increase the security, increase the quality, and make data more usable. But it wasn't just the financial crisis that was the catalyst here. It was also the perfect storm brewing by the advent of the smartphone, social media, new forms of big data, as we've heard about, the need to work with analytics. All of this perfect storm started brewing probably the middle part of last decade to say, if we want to have data a reusable asset in our company, we need to put policies around it. And most of the thinking around data governance has always been about turning data into a useful asset, which means we can share it with others. So if we think about a picture of that from the model I had earlier, we're simply saying now that we're applying these principles to data as opposed to just a generic view. And we start to look at the strategic intent of why you're doing this. Well, usually it's because I want to use data to compete, or I want data to make me more insightful so I can do something different in my company, or maybe to be more disruptive. So if we think about this as a model from data governance There's workers that influence how data is being generated and consumed, and there's the data itself being governed. So if we walk through this, we see that data governance has always had the view, or should have had the view, of being strategically aligned to what I want to accomplish as a company, which means if I want to compete in analytics, which has been a theme for 10 to 15 years now, there's been many books published in this space, but it's based on the premise that I can reuse, share, and repurpose data. It means I have to think about data as a corporate asset, not as a necessary evil. That means I have to have policies around it to say, how can I protect it? How can I make it useful? How can I make it more available, et cetera? So the drivers for governance have been competitive. They've also been regulatory. There's also a heightened amount of customer expectations for personalizing services for them. There's also been changes in technology. So these become the drivers to govern just data. Now, the result of this governance should be policies and accountabilities. What is the impact of that? Well, it affects how we do work. Now, if we think about the work that is directly associated with data, there's different kinds of work we do, and there's different kinds of workers. So we need policies around how the work is carried out. It could be around the quality and security aspects of our data, how data infrastructures, databases, and et cetera are designed, how architecture is produced to make data flow and make it more available to us. There's also how people become more literate in how to use data in terms of opportunities for their own business processes. So there's policies we need to influence the behavior of people doing this kind of work. Now, the policies get translated into procedures because it's the procedures that drive how people do their work. And so kind of the procedures here understand, how do we actually manage data? How do we manage data infrastructure? How do we manage security around data? How do we manage metadata so we know where our data is? How do we catalog it to make it more available? So the procedures and policies should drive the management, but we also put a life cycle to our data. And life cycle means I know when to keep it, when to get rid of it. And I know how to find new data I don't have that I might need. So think of life cycle as almost a manufacturing process. So we have to understand that. And it also drives the methods and approaches we need to take so that we're doing things consistently with the intent of the company in terms of data sharing, data reuse, and data collaboration. So that becomes the work of people who are interacting specifically with data. Now, so if we think about the data being governed because of their work, this means that people are following the policies in an aligned fashion to do work on the data, so with the principal sharing of making the data more valuable to us. So how do we organize the data being governed? Well, usually it's by some criteria, like some common theme, like it's all about the same topic or a subject, or the data is all from a certain system, or it's about a certain process, or certain data is about a certain use case or application. So if we think about the scope of the data being governed, it could be in one of those categories. Now, why are we doing this? Well, it's to make data more useful to more people. And we want to repurpose data. So we should have higher quality. And higher quality, in my definition, says it's more useful to more people. We want to reuse data to share it across some sort of a life cycle. But we also have to protect it and secure it. So we respect privacy, we respect regulations, et cetera. We need to make data more available to more people and more accessible. Now, accessible means I have the literacy and skills to find it and get it. So if we deal with these issues, then the data by itself, hopefully, is starting to produce value. Now, but I'm going to show you a little bit later that data by itself can't produce value. This is where the change in thinking has to happen, because data per se enables value, but it by itself can't produce value. It's an indirect link. But there's risk around data of not using it or sharing it or misinterpreting it. We want to manage that, and we want to have this value idea, but we have to rethink what value means and how it's actually produced. But this is the general thinking that's been around for data governance for the last probably decade and a half or so. Okay, so my premise is that if that's the thinking that's been in place for the last I don't know, say 10 to 15 years or so, is that too narrow? Do we have to reimagine what it is we're governing? Because I say governance is a general approach to putting policies around the things that help me create a better world for myself. But if we think of data as something we're governing by itself, my premise is that that's too narrow. We have to broaden our thinking. Now, why is that? It's because we want to make money in our companies or some other forms of value. So it could be monetary value, like profit, or it could be non-monetary, like safety or security or a cleaner environment. So some form of value is really what we're after. The data is a stepping stone to getting there. It's an indirect link. And if we don't recognize that data is an indirect link and we govern it by itself in isolation, we may not actually produce the business value we're looking for because we're too focused on the indirect component. So what I'm recommending here, and I'm discussing here in this line of thinking, is we have to shift our thinking from simply governing data to governing data value. Now, and I've already said that data by itself doesn't provide value. It's an enabler of value. So we have to think about how to construct some kind of a model or some sort of a perspective on the role that data plays in producing true measurable value for an organization. And this is part of what I'm talking, because this will come back to our scope definition of what it is we're governing. And I want to introduce now the concept of what's called the value stream. It's sometimes called the value chain or a value stream. And I'm going to show you a diagram in a second. But we're going to recognize that if we're trying to produce sustainable business value where data is an enabler of that, data is only one of the components. Much like the analogy, if you're making a nice pot of chili, the meat or the beans or the onions are just one of the components to that. But we want to blend them together to make a great pot of chili. And so it's the value stream that connects things that I really believe we have to start to govern. And that is going to have us, it's going to make us sort of think about this a little bit differently. So we can't independently look at data by itself to create value, but data value is what we should care about. So we want to actually, I believe, start to think about governing data value streams, not just the data, which means we have a broader challenge on our hands to understand how to actually do that. So let's take a step back and say, what the heck is value and how do we generate it? And what role does data play in taking us there? Because as I said, data is simply one of the components, but it's a very key component. So if the data is poor, the value stream won't be successful, but the data by itself isn't sufficient. So that's what we have to sort of look at. So let's think about value streams for a second. Now, this kind of thinking comes from different kinds of business improvement concepts, things like lean management or different kinds of business modeling techniques to say, how do we connect the dots of different things to produce a result? Now, life is more complex than a single value stream shows, but it's a starting point because really what we're talking about here is building a system of components that have to interact to drive results. So if we think about this for a second, and this is sort of generic, just a bunch of items here, but I'll show you an example of data in a second. Start to imagine that you have to assemble a recipe to produce value where data is a primary ingredient. What are the other components? And the other components, we're going to say, touch on people and processes and skills and policies. There's other things we have to get involved with here. So the impact is what I really want to produce. Now, impact is the result of using data in maybe a different or a novel way. But impact is something that changes in our company because we've done something. Impact is a change in a condition. And hopefully, if it's the impact in the right area, we value it. So we could say that a positive impact is an increase in value. Now, categories of impact, because we have to think there's different kinds of impacts we can produce. This goes back to thinking about how an organization makes money or is successful. And if we think about these, there's sort of 5 categories I've listed here, and just to think about the kinds of areas where impact happens. It could be around efficiency, effectiveness, quality, innovation, or agility. Now, what are these really talking about? Efficiency is an impact area where I do something better. I'm more productive. I do things with less cost. So I do more with less. So if I want to become to reduce cost or decrease times, I think about efficiency impacts. So the question is, where do I want to become more efficient? How can I do more work with less resources? What role can data play in getting me there? Now think about effectiveness for a second. What is effectiveness? Effectiveness is really the ability to produce the results you're looking for. In other words, it's knowing what work you should do to produce the results my company wants. So if you're efficient, you're just doing work better. If you're effective, you're doing the right work better. So you have to know, is the work I'm doing or the processes I'm carrying out leading to the results I want? So I might have to have data to measure that for me. Think about quality for a second. In this case, I'm talking about quality as really as a measure of consistency. And consistency usually has a link to efficiency, but it really means there's less waste produced, there's less rework having to be done, and usually quality leads to a happier customer. So quality is a measure of consistency and really, I guess, customer service or customer impact. Now, the last two here on this list are a little more novel. So when you think about being innovative or innovation impact, think about disrupting. Think about companies like the Ubers of the world or the Airbnbs of the world who have disrupted traditional businesses by using data as a way to drive new business models. So I'm talking about innovation here as a way of using data to drive new business models that maybe you can't even imagine what they are right now. Excuse me. Think about agility for a second. When I talk about agility here, I'm talking about the ability to respond to changing conditions in the marketplace or in the technology space more quickly than your competitors can. So agility is a measure of responsiveness and at an organizational level. So there may be other areas of impact, but I've given lots of thought to it, and I think these 5 categories do a pretty good job at covering the kinds of impact we could possibly create. Now, each of these categories can lead to different specific use cases. So the point of a value stream is to say if value flows from left to right, requirements flow from right to left. So if I understand what impact I want to create, maybe it's delivering a product to a customer in less time with less cost, and that's an efficiency impact. So the requirements working its way down through this value chain says, what do these various items to the left have to do to enable that impact? And one of these items is probably going to be the world of data. Now, once I understand what these requirements are, value will start to flow from left to right, assuming I have the right components in place. Now, if one of the items is missing or is working at a substandard level, then value can stop flowing, and I don't see the impact I'm looking for. So think about value streams as a way to understand how things across departments or organizational units must interact and work together to produce positive results. So this is a very generic view, and I'm going to show you an example in a second in terms of the world of data. So you can think of this as a system where items blend and combine together to enable the creation and flow of value. Before I move on to the next slide, there's one other property you can sort of think of. Because a value stream is really a form of a system, there's an interesting property within systems. And if you think about when you combine things and you blend things together, what you're doing here with these items in this value stream, there's a concept called the emergent property. And the emergent property is the magic that happens when you blend the right things together. And it's analogous to when, again, go back to the cooking analogy, when you make a great pot of chili or a great soup or a stew or a spaghetti sauce, the ingredients that go into that are probably commodity ingredients. And even individually, they may not taste good by themselves. But when you blend them together, there's a magic that happens that the flavor through that combination is incredible if it's a good pot of chili or spaghetti sauce, that isn't, the flavor isn't present in any one of the ingredients. And let me give you one other example about the emergent property, because this is really critical when you start to put governance into this discussion. If you think about an automobile as a piece of technology, and in today's world, cars can't drive by themselves, but maybe in the future they can, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Think about an automobile as a piece of technology, and by itself, it cannot move. Now, if you add a human component to it, you've now enabled the automobile plus the person to drive at highway speeds. So the person by themselves cannot, the car by itself cannot, together it can go at whatever highway speed you want to drive at. Now that's called the emergent property. That's the impact you can produce when you combine the right things. And that's what I'm talking about here when we start to blend and combine the right ingredients, which is through a value stream. Now, if I take this generic kind of discussion and I say, what does it mean if I talk about a data value stream? It means, how do I go from data to value? Because I said data by itself is an indirect link. So this is now, again, this is very simplified because this is just for the purposes of this webinar, but there's more components to it. But at a really simplistic level, we have an impact, and I said this is the impact I want to produce. So I said, I talked earlier about efficiency, effectiveness, quality, etc. If these are one of the areas I want to produce, I might have a value stream per area. That is the true measure of value. So if I get an increase in some condition, how do I get that increase in condition? That's what the components in blue to the left of this are supposed to do. What are the requirements I have to make that impact possible? So the components in a data value stream are shown here, where we go from actions, decisions, analysis, and data. So I want to walk through these and have a discussion that data is critical here, but it's by no means enough. And so that's what I want to kind of go through the next kind of discussions here. So we said impact was the increase of some condition that I want to achieve. But the actions that lead to that are people doing work or some sort of an activity. It's a person making a sales call. It's a person making a product. It's a person hiring somebody else. It's a person shipping a product or pricing a product. So this is the actions we do. Now, when you think about the actions in companies, we can categorize those at different levels. And we have, excuse me, we can have strategic actions, tactical actions, and operational actions. And this is a way to get our heads around what types of data are we going to need to drive these actions. Strategic actions are really when we're starting to create a strategic vision or plan and setting goals and objectives for the organization. And it's really around setting the direction for the organization, what levels of profit or revenue or market share we're trying to pursue. That's a strategic direction and an objective. Now, the tactical work is what resources do we need to get there? If the strategy says we have to grow X% in this market, the tactical questions are what resources in terms of people, machines, equipment, office space, investments, what resources do we need to achieve our strategic intent? So tactical work, you could argue, is procurement, construction, hiring, seeking investments. It's all the work around acquiring resources so we can achieve our strategy. But operational work is all the work done to use the existing available resources we have. So we think about operational activities. It says, oh, you give me these resources. I got people, equipment, machines, vehicles, whatever I have, and now I can utilize these resources in a way to operate and execute towards the strategy. But when I'm operating, I have to deal with things like constraints and bottlenecks and delays and inefficiencies, and I have to ask myself, do I have the right resources available? Maybe I have too many or too few, and they're not allocated properly. So I start to think about the different kinds of actions we need to put in place that lead to the impact I'm trying to pursue. So that's this next piece of the value chain. The middle piece now is we're going to call is the decision box. And when we think about decisions should lead to the correct actions I want to take. Now, a decision, if you think about what decisions are really made of, it's looking at the options available to me. But how do I know how do I know what options I have? So looking at surely the options that are in front of me, what is the impact of different options, both intended or unintended consequences of my actions? What is the quality of my decision? Now, by quality, I mean how quickly, how much cost. Can I make this decision more timely, with less pondering and less delay? Can I make the decision more timely because it's more urgent? So I have a more informed, and I've reduced the risk of an inappropriate decision by considering options in a more timely fashion. Now, every decision has a risk associated with it. What is risk essentially? Risk is a measure of uncertainty. So if I can reduce the uncertainty of my decisions, how, maybe through information, then I have a more confidence in taking what actions I should take. So if I can score my decisions or my options, I can decide then what action I should take that lead to the impact. So this is the decision box. And again, these decisions can be made at the level of work, which could be strategic, tactical, or operational. So strategic is what level of market share do I want to achieve? Tactically is who do I buy my resources from and at what price? And operationally is how do I schedule the work based on the resources I have to do? And that would then lead to the actions we want to take. Now, all of this is based on being informed. So the next box, we could have different labels here. I've called it analysis. It could be called analytics. It could be called information. I've done it to kind of simplify it here, only to say that this box is really the heart of where analytics, maybe artificial intelligence, and data science might fit today. Analysis is trying to generate the right information or insight we need to drive the decisions that will lead to the actions I want to take. So analysis is quite often starts with problem framing, understanding the area you're trying to make a decision around. What is the true objective of your decision? Do you understand your goal and objective? Do you understand the variables that'll drive the actions you want to lead? So you need information. Now, information, where does it come from? Well, eventually it's going to come from data on the left. We'll get to that in a second. But information is really the answer to a person's question. Now, who has these questions? Who are the skilled, literate people that have challenging, probing, tough questions? If you don't have good insight about the organization in the first place, you're not going to have very good questions. So analysis is heavily based on having people that are having the right skills and the knowledge and literacy to know what questions to ask so we can use data to drive answers, to drive decisions. So analysis is much more than technology. It's much more than algorithms. It's much more than, but they're important. So this is also where a lot of people have to have confidence, literacy, and experience to formulate questions that are more deeper and insightful than simply say, what happened? So we have to ask questions like, how do I improve this? Or what are my opportunities? And how can I drive change? And so we need to frame problems in a way that'll answer ways to improve the organization. So again, the analysis box here includes many components: how we ask questions, how we frame problems, what algorithms we build, what models we deploy, things around the quality of information, and the degree of integration we apply to the raw data. So we could frame questions as simple questions, which are fact-based, like what happened, when did it happen, etc. And we could have more advanced questions, which is more around how can I improve this, or what will happen if I do that. And so the kinds of questions we want to answer will drive the need for different kinds of data and different kinds of models and algorithms. But this is a very important box that understands how data will be applied to drive the work we want to do. Okay, now the piece we've been focusing on with data is the foundation of this value stream. So if we talk about data governance, and we've talked about that in isolation, we're simply talking about this first box in the chain. So data by itself, we know, has different kinds of properties. And data governance historically for the last decade and a half have been focusing on these individual kind of characteristics. So quality of data, my definition of data quality is, it's a relative term that if data is more useful to more people, it is of higher quality. Now, there are absolute conditions in data quality discussions like accuracy, completeness, and that kind of thing. We have to understand the requirements of my analysis for consistency, accuracy, and completeness. And I want to know if the data I have is useful enough for the analysis I want to do. So when I manage quality, I'm understanding what data can be used to answer what forms of questions so I can then support the value chain. Security is all around protecting the privacy and regulations associated with data, so we minimize and avoid lawsuits and regulatory compliance issues. We have the challenge of making data more accessible. If the goal is to make data more useful to more people, how do people know it's there and how do they understand it? So the level of understanding is important from a governance point of view, because we have to make people aware and have the skills to find what they're looking for and not be confused by it or misinterpret it. The data needs to be sufficiently timely for the timeline of the value chain or value stream. So if something is at a strategic level, the timeliness is probably in the order of days to weeks to months. where the timeline on the operational value stream might be in the order of seconds to minutes to hours. So the timeliness is really important to know what level of analysis we're trying to carry out here. Is the data sufficiently available to the right people? Are we protecting ourselves from a compliance point of view and a privacy point of view that we only make data, the right data is available for the people who are authorized to see it? So that's a big issue. And is it compliant with all the regulations, both internal and external, that will drive the sufficient and acceptable use of that data? So if we think about this now, and we walk through this value stream, we see there's many pieces of a puzzle. And the pieces of the puzzle need to collectively work together, just like the components of your car have to work well together, or your car will not move very far. So if the challenge here is really something around the question of going back to our original governance kind of model, the question is, what should we govern? What should our scope be? And initially, we said scope was defined by the things being governed. So are we governing simply data, or are we governing data value? Now, if we're simply governing data, we're in the left side of that value chain. If we're governing data value, we're governing the full value stream. Now, this has a lot of organizational impacts because historically, different parts of an organization really had different parts of this under their sort of their purview or their domain. So the question is, how do we organize ourselves so that we're collectively coordinating this at a level that we respect the organization of the company, but yet we're providing alignment and governance over the full chain? That becomes the challenge. So I'm talking now about data value governance, not just data governance. So traditional data governance has been the leftmost box, which we talk about things it's been focusing on. So traditionally, data governance job was to support policies to make data more available to more people and to protect it and secure it and make it more useful to people. But it didn't concern itself with how data was going to be used or what value it was going to actually produce. But that means you could have lots of good data that nobody used, and you had no impact on if the data was going to be acted on or not. So let me give you another little perspective that I'd like to share when I talk about this topic. And I'll give you a personal example. I'll give you an example from a TV sitcom about why it's important to govern this full value chain. From a personal experience point of view, I was driving my car on the freeway last summer, and the low tire pressure indicator came on my dashboard. So I'm getting this new insight from the instruments in my car, and it came on and indicated I had a problem. And with my biases, I dismissed it. So I said, there's got to be a fault signal. So I pressed the reset on it, and it cleared. A few minutes later, it came back on again. And my bias said, oh, it's got to be just another fault signal. I don't want to have a delay here. So I did this 2 or 3 times, and I reset the indicator. And by the 4th occurrence of the signal, rather than getting the signal, I got a noise called thump, 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 and I had a flat tire. And I ignored what the data was trying to tell me. And so that is a classic case where how people can ignore with their biases the impact of data on the actions you should be taking. So I paid the price. I decided to ignore the data, and I paid the price by having to call the Motor League and tow me to a local repair place at a waste of my time, an extra cost, and a lot of aggravation. So the fact that I wasn't incented to react to this in a positive way, the data really is of no value. Let me give you another example. This is from a TV sitcom, The Office. So the old show, The Office, was quite popular in from 2005 to the early part of this decade. And Michael Scott was the buffoon office manager who was sort of a technology phobe. He didn't like technology. But in one episode, he got a new car where in that era, GPSs were very novel and new. So he got a new car and had a GPS to help him navigate the car. And he was afraid to use it. So his staff kept telling him, Michael, you got to use the GPS. Trust it. Use the technology. It'll guide you to good places. So he took the technology and literally took it literally to the nth degree, didn't challenge it, and drove his car into a lake. Now, he paid the same price I did. He wasted his time. He had to get a tow truck to tow him out of the lake. I had to get a tow truck to tow me off the highway. So in both cases, I ignored the signal. He took the signal too literally and it didn't challenge it. Now, we both paid the price of that. So if we don't govern how people will interpret data and internalize data and deal with biases and know how to challenge it with critical thinking, then data itself could be a dangerous thing that's not used, or it's used blindly. So my point here is, if we don't govern the value chain, we're opening ourselves to risks of, again, lack of use or blind use. And that's what we're trying to avoid. And so I believe we have to broaden our discussions from simply looking at governing data to governing data value, recognizing that it's this value stream that tells us how the data is going to be used. And that's what I should really care about, is the value that's being left on the table because I'm not using it properly, and opportunities to improve how data can be used. And I think we have to broaden our perspective. Now, what are the implications of this? Well, it means we have a much broader scope. But does it really? Does it mean we have broader scope, or we simply have to coordinate what's already going on in the company? Now, a lot of stuff is already taking place in terms of corporate governance and process governance, and different kinds of governance in terms of we're doing elsewhere in the company. My perspective is we have to connect dots between what we've thought about as data governance to other forms of corporate governance or operational governance. I think we have to think about this as a holistic system and make sure it's integrated so that the policies reflect the capture, use, and sharing of data, but also the use of that data, and also to incent people to use the data in the decisions they're making if you want to become data driven, and to see if the actions are being taken and the right impact is being produced. Because if I was on the board of directors of a company, I want to know this value chain is working. And I want to have some confidence that the value chain is being governed. And I probably have I do. I have many value chains in my company. And I want to know if those value chains are breaking or if they're working effectively. Because it's the value chains that are going to give me the results I'm looking for. Now, it's going to be more complex, and there's more stakeholders, and there's a larger set of policies here. But I think if we start to connect the dots between what's already being done, it's really a matter of coordination and collaboration. Now, if we do this, governance now has a direct link to value. It's no longer an indirect link, because we're governing the full chain. We're not simply governing a piece of it. And that is a tremendous different perspective, that we're not enabling value, we're actually creating value. And it's recognizing that the thing we're governing, the scope has increased to these different boxes and components I've talked about, and yet each of these requires policies and incentives so we can align our organization to make sure that the data is used impactfully where it should be. So that becomes the thinking behind broadening our view from just data to data value. Now, that has implications on scope. So I had the axis earlier here about goals and the things being governed. I'm simply saying now that rather than looking at the scope individually about whether you're governing a project, or you're governing a product, or governing a customer, or if you're simply governing data, or if you're governing safety, those are things we govern in our companies. But if we think about this at a value stream level, we're now governing value streams. That means that the things being governed, in this case on the x-axis, collectively have to all be governed together because they add up to the solution we're looking for. And that is the challenge. Now, what are the goals of governance? How do you know if governance is successful or effective? We have to give ourselves goals. And I've already talked, these goals relate to the impact we're trying to produce by governing them. It could be a heightened level of capabilities. It could be a higher level of quality, or constraining our levels of security. The goals could be around efficiency. The goals here could come from that list of impact. So the impact areas I'm trying to produce, whether it's around agility, innovation, efficiency, et cetera, I talked about, are actually become the goals of governance. So we have to make sure if we have the right policies in place to produce those goals. And now there's a one-for-one link between governance and its goals and the value streams that produce the results. And now there's a link between governance of value using data to produce organizational results. So this is, again, broader. There's organizational implications to this, and how we coordinate and drive this through some sort of an office. Now, what that means is, how do we get started? How do we get organized? A lot of governance doesn't have to be heavy-handed and disruptive. A lot of times, think of governance as the ability to maybe rethink how you coordinate maybe work that's already being done. And I like to use the analogy, and I like to use analogies a lot, but I'll give you another analogy about how governance can be thought of. Think about it as a symphony orchestra. And a symphony orchestra is all the musicians. That's the staff in your company. Those are the different departments. You've got a department who's playing the woodwinds and the percussion and the brass and something else, and they're all there. Now, before the concert starts, everybody's tuning up and playing some warm-up song, and it's all very chaotic, and it doesn't sound good music at all. When the orchestra conductor steps to the podium, and the orchestra conductor starts to wave the baton, he or she is creating alignment through the musicians that they're all playing the same song at the same tempo and the same pace. The musicians were already there. They're already experienced and knowing what to do. But through coordination, you get them to go from a random set of noise to a symphony orchestra kind of playing good music. So I like to think about governance as a coordinating body. It can be a very lean organization, but it's going to be based heavily on the last point on this slide, which is around accountabilities and resource assignment. But let me get to that in a second. So if we think about the musicians as the people living in silos, the coordination of governance is to get you out of your silos and to think organizationally. You're no longer a finance department or a sales department or a manufacturing department. You are a piece of an organization that is part of a value stream. And getting out of your silos starts to realize we have to manage this through a consistency to drive the change to our customers. We need to think organizationally, not departmentally. That becomes a big shift in thinking. Too often, before we wanted to use analytics to drive our change, we would think departmentally and get away with it because we would run a billing system, or we'd run an order system, or we'd run some sort of a production planning system in our nice little silos. But as soon as we want to use analytics to drive change in the marketplace and be disruptive and to drive insights, we can't get away with that anymore. We have to think organizationally. And my view is that governance is the pathway to think organizationally. We need to think about our customers' engagement. Customers think about us as organizations, not as departments. We need to understand the value streams that are working together, where data is a part of the value stream, but it's not all by itself. Now, the way we coordinate things is through virtual organizational structures. Now, what does that mean? It means I'm going to talk, before I end off with my discussion here in a few minutes, we need to think about the concept of a program, a delivery program. A program is meant to be a virtual structure, and by virtual I mean we probably have dotted line responsibilities from different parts of the organization reporting to a program leadership team of some kind. It's the leadership team that helps to make sure the right policies are being developed, that they're being translated, they're being acted on, and there's some sort of an enforcement activity going on. So the organizational structure has to overlay on top of our existing vertical structure. So most virtual structures I'm talking about here are horizontal in nature. It's having the leadership to tie the groups together to work at a value stream level. Now, several companies are currently in the process of putting in, well, this isn't new really, for the last maybe 10 years or so, but chief data officers or chief analytics officers or chief performance officers, their mandate and job is to get data, is to get value from data. So they have to think at a value stream level. That means we have to coordinate these activities across these different silos so that they're enabling each other. So the organizational structure, there's different models to follow, and we haven't got time to talk about that today, but think of the different structures as being, in some cases it could be a department, but in most cases it's not. It's getting a small team of people that coordinate the organization. But you can't do that without authority and without executive support. So the accountabilities come with leadership and they come with authority. So you have influence over how the silos work, and people have to be comfortable working in matrix organizations with dotted line responsibilities so that the work we do is consistent with the policies. And if you think about this, another simple example to think about how corporate safety is managed. We don't have to be a safety specialist to be safe, but we have safety specialists who develop policies to say, how should we be kept safe? So if you're working in an industrial company where there's lots of dangerous situations and materials and whatnot, the policies are designed to say, you need to have a face mask in this part of the plant. You need to understand what this alarm means, how to react if there's some sort of a leak. Or if we're not an industrial company, we have a big parking lot, we have to know what are the policies for how we drive in our parking lot and how we park our cars. We have policies in our offices about we can't ride a bicycle down the hallway, or we can't play touch football in the conference room. These become policies that are common sense, but it's the safety policies to say you can't do this in this situation, or you need to do that in a different situation. So we can all become safe without having to be safety specialists. But if there's a fire alarm or a tornado alert or something going on, we all follow the policies to know what to do in a situation where this maybe leads to a lack of safety. That means there's accountable people in the company that develop the safety policies that we all have to follow. And that same metaphor can be used in terms of the world of data, in terms of data value. So my point here is that we need to have some mechanism to assign accountabilities and authority across organizational boundaries. And I believe that the mechanism for doing that is what I call a program. Now, programs might have different definitions out there, but I'm calling a program a virtual structure that might have a leader or a committee or a team that leads it, but it has responsibilities to get work done by people in different parts of the organization, and it has accountabilities assigned to get the work done. It has a program. In this case, it might be a data governance program, or it could be a data value governance program. It has business objectives. This goes back to the impact I want to produce. Its job is to coordinate multiple projects and multiple activities, and it also can provide services to the organization to make itself more competent and more capable. So my belief is that programs are designed to coordinate the delivery of many projects and provide many services to the organization, with the intent of making sure that the value streams we're talking about are well coordinated, aligned, so that the value and impact we're producing is there and realizable. So you can think about governance, and sometimes the word governance gets in the way. We think of governance as a speed bump. Think of governance, a governance program, as a way of enabling excellence. You could call this data value excellence as opposed to data value governance. You could brand it that way. We tend to call it governance because that's what it's been called for the last several years. So we think of governance as policy enabling, but it could lead to things we call operational excellence, and that can only happen at the value stream level. So think about programs as an organizational structure that overlays on top of the traditional vertical structure we have to draw people together. It's the orchestra conductor. The different musicians live in our different departments, and we're trying to align them. We're trying to get them to play the same song, and that comes from authority and coordination. Now, what happens now, think of some examples of integrated programs. This might be occurring in your company without realizing it, that data governance or data value governance needs to be a part of these existing threads. So people do operational excellence for process improvement today. There are data science programs going on. Some companies are doing digital transformation projects. We're exercising and doing lean management to get rid of waste in our companies. We have customer experience improvement programs, process automation. Some people, we have business intelligence and analytics programs. These are all examples of programs. Now, what this means is that all of these are heavily dependent on data, and they all want to produce value from data. So rather than governing data separately and independently, we need to value or govern data value holistically across the different programs. And that becomes a coordination activity where we want to connect the dots between the different maybe programs or activities and understand how these things become enabled and coordinated.
We are Starweaver, education you can bank on. For more information, contact us.